and something that is common that everybody else writes on. If you write well enough, you're not going to be penalized, right? If you write well enough and clear enough, and you have all the examples and it's tied in tightly with the question, that means you are not writing about euthanasia in an abstract manner, but relating it back to how it relates to the position that the independent courts basically took, and then subsequently it turned into law, right? So it was basically the politicians and the government taking the cue from the independent court. So how you tie it back to the question, even if everybody in this class writes an answer about the independent courts in the Dutch euthanasia case, if your answer is clear, if it is tight, if the rest of the discussion relating to delegation of power is accurate, right, and spot on, then you still have a very good chance of doing well. So don't, convince yourself and say that, I have to write something that is unique and very different from everybody else in order to do well, right? Okay. I think that is a bit of a, some students think that that is an exam strategy. If you don't do it properly, then you basically run the risk of not doing well either, right? So it's okay, right? Go ahead, use the same examples as in your subject guide, but make sure that, it's accurate. They cannot penalize you for using, examples or using case studies or explaining things in a simple manner, right? They can only tell you that, you've done well because you've answered the question, right? So that's basically, the point that I want to focus on, as you are moving towards, preparation for your prelim exams and so on. All right, let's look at the questions for this topic, okay? All right, the focus of the question, all right, usually is the reasons behind delegation of power. So the whole logic behind delegation of power, or what we refer to as the importance of non-elected institutions, right? So in the exam question, right, they can refer to them as either independent institutions. Okay, maybe you want to write this down. All right, okay, so remind yourself. All right, they can refer to it either as independent institutions, right, or they can refer to it as non-elected institutions. Okay, if you see independent institutions or non-elected institutions, you should know that they are referring to this topic, number one. Number two, if you see the word delegation of power, right, the basic idea behind this logic of delegation of power is that the elected institutions, meaning your politicians, right, who become the government, right? The government is what is elected, right? We elect your politicians, right? So the whole logic behind delegation of power is that these elected institutions, these elected politicians, right, they take some of their power that is bestowed on them by you, the voter, right? The voter uses their power, right, to vote for the politicians. Politicians get elected, right? So politicians are technically your representatives. They are supposed to make policy decisions on your behalf for you. All right, that's the whole logic behind democracy. That's the whole logic behind elections, right? Why we have elections and so on, right? And that is how it's related to the policy making process. So where this logic of delegation of power comes into the picture, right, is that these elected institutions, these elected politicians, they take some of their power and they then transfer it or give it to these independent institutions, which can either be, in this syllabus, either the independent court or the independent central bank. And these independent institutions, or what we refer to as unelected institutions or non-elected institutions, all these three terms can be used interchangeably. These independent institutions then make decisions on behalf of the elected politicians, right? And they do so based on the idea that these independent institutions have the technical expertise to do so, right? So that is where we get the logic about, number one, what are independent institutions? Number two, why should this delegation of power occur? I gave you this brief background first, because I want to explain the logic of the focus of the exam question, right? So as we run through the topic, you can see, okay, this is how they are going to test you. What are they going to test you on? What you need to include. Okay? So this is what the logic of delegation of power basically is about. I know I summarize everything in just these 2 sentences, right? I'll go into in-depth subsequently. All right. So that's the first main focus. Second main focus of the exam questions, that means what you need to include when the marker reads your exam answer. These are the elements of the exam answer that they should be receiving. Number one, you explaining to them why delegation of power actually occurs. I mean, the reasons behind these politicians transferring power to these independent courts or these independent banks, central banks, right? Why do they want to transfer power? You receive power from the voters, right? Why are you transferring power to these independent institutions, right? So that's the logic behind, why should delegation of power occur? Okay. Then the logic is this, right? They want to see an evaluation. So according to you, right, are there any benefits to this delegation of power, or are there a lot of costs associated with this delegation of power? What is good about it? What can go wrong? And when things do go wrong, how can we set it right again? That's the whole logic behind, is delegation of power good for democracy? And we link it to the idea of democracy because this whole thing is related to representation. It is related to policy making. It is related, and policy making is about what the citizen wants. Remember, we go back to the original logic that we've been discussing about ideal points, right? When a voter votes for a politician, when a voter votes for a political party, right, they vote on the basis of the ideal point. They vote on the basis, right, that when I vote for this political party A, right, is approaching, say, for example, climate change policy in a way that is very closely linked to my sentiments on climate change policy. So my ideal point and political party A's ideal point, right, is actually very close to each other. And at the end of the day, when I vote for political party A, I expect, right, government policy that, when political party A becomes government, right? So government policy to reflect my ideal point. Remember, that is the logic that we discussed very, very long ago, right? It seems just recent, right? But actually it was many, many weeks ago, right, that we discussed this. So that's the rationale down here, right? So how is this delegation of power, which now places the ability to make decisions, to make policy, right, in the hands of these independent institutions? How does this differ from the elected politicians making these decisions? Correct? So how does this impact on democracy? If you've got an independent institution, if you've got a non-elected institution, are they accountable to the citizens? Are they accountable to the citizens technically? Are they directly accountable to the citizens in the same way as politicians are directly accountable to the citizens? Yes or no? No, not the same, right? Because can you vote out a court? Can you vote out any what? Yeah, yeah. Hmm. Hmm. How could you get rid of them? Fire them? No, okay. Wait, what do you mean by how could you get rid of them? Meaning like, wow. Uh-huh. Okay. Okay, I see where you're going with this. So that would have to do with, okay, in the first place, right, which I'm going to address subsequently, that has to do with the appointment process, right? Okay, because the rationale is that if you have independent institutions, right, you have your judges, right, in the courts, right? Who appoints these judges? Are these judges appointed by a particular political party, right? In that case, that means their appointment, right, would be, if the judges are appointed by political party or they're appointed by politicians, their appointment is therefore, are they appointed based on the fact that they are the best people for the job necessarily? No, not necessarily. Which means their appointment is, if I am appointed by a politician or a political party, or like what you say, president, right, and so on. My appointment is therefore, I may likely make decisions that are in line with the interest of the person that appointed me. So therefore, my appointment is, starts with a P. But yeah, it's correct, politicized, right? So if my appointment is politicized, right, then like what Asad mentioned, right? You could have a scenario that the people would subsequently be suspicious, or the judgments, right, that these judges tend to deliver are more in line with what the politicians basically want, rather than reflect actual considerations for the polity instead. Correct? Like say for example, there was a scramble. Remember, like what we saw when Trump was subsequently almost nearing re-election. What were the Republicans and Trump basically trying to do? They were scrambling to appoint as many judges as possible to the Supreme Court, right? And then you had what was that lady's name? The Amy Coney Barrett, right? Who basically, I think I could answer some of the questions better than what she answered, right? And she still managed to sail through and get her appointment, right? And then they had this whole hoo-ha about how several of these policies relating to, say, abortion, like Roe versus Wade, right, that are in great danger of being overturned and so on, right? Yeah, so that's the rationale down here. The other way, like what Asad asked, right, is that if you find that the appointments have been highly politicized, right, then you could see a change occurring if you have a different political party that becomes government subsequently, number one. Number two, it can be a case of judicial reform, right? Say, for example, opposite to what the scenario that Asad painted. If you look at Poland, today, all right? Poland is at a great odds with, and I've got the example for you in the slides for you down there. Poland is at great odds with the EU, right? As a result of judicial reform that occurred a couple of years ago, I think around 2018, 2019, right? Poland engaged, I cannot remember what the political party's name is. It's in the slide. Poland engaged in judicial reform, where basically what they did was the judicial reform empowered politicians vis-a-vis the independent courts and the judges, right? Which has basically messed up the way the Polish courts can respond to responding to interpreting law. And basically what it does, it puts more power in the hands of the elected politicians, right? And allows them to politicize interpretation of law. And they also have given, if I'm not wrong, the ability of the politicians to, I think, remove 2 out of 5 of the judges sitting on the Supreme Courts and so on. And this is seen as a direct it contravenes directly EU law regarding the independence of judicial institutions, right? And the EU has been at odds with Poland, right, for quite a long period of time, and it has come to hit in the last couple of months. Poland basically stands not to be kicked out of the EU, right? But Poland stands to basically get into trouble in the sense that they could basically be receiving a daily fine from the EU for basically not, accommodating and following typical, EU law regarding judicial independence and so on, right? So, it depends. In this case, right, these changes came about in 2018, 2019 as a result of, the political party that was in power. So it depends. You can a system can undergo judicial reform, like what we saw in Sri Lanka as well, right? There were I think I've used this example in a previous discussion before, the parliamentary versus the presidential system, right? And the same thing, whether the the power is in the hands of the the elected politicians or the president if it's a presidential system, or the parliamentary system if it is a the prime minister if it's a parliamentary system and his cabinet, right? To make adjustments to the appointment process, to make adjustments to the ability to appoint particular individuals, right, based on particular affiliations. You could appoint judges based on ethnic background, right? You can appoint judges or the central bank, those that sit on the central bank committee, right, based on your alma mater, or based on political donations, based on what your affiliations are. It could be patron clientele kind of relationships. Okay, all right. Okay, we'll come back to that in a little while. Okay, so the other point that I also want to emphasize, right? Okay, is the third bullet point in the first section. Should unelected or independent institutions be allowed to make all important decisions in a democracy or a government? This one, right, is very similar to an actual exam question, where the emphasis, look at the emphasis on the. Look at that statement. What is the manipulative keyword in that system, in that statement, that allows you to play around with it? Yeah. Yeah. All. Right? All. Right? That is the main point down here. Right? Should they be allowed to make all important decisions? When is it good for them to make these important decisions? When can it be detrimental or potentially dangerous, right? Should they be given that much power to make these decisions, right? So that means the question, or the logic behind that statement, right, is that how much power should be delegated? That means the extent of power, right, that should be delegated away from elected politicians to these independent institutions, right? So why should power be delegated away? For what reasons? Why does it even occur in the first place, right? Is it good for democracy in the sense that does it impact, right, the kinds of policies that would affect individuals, right? Does it impact the kinds of decisions that would affect whether my interests as a voter are being represented, right? Does it impact on the logic of what democracy basically is about, right? Is it representative? Is it made? Are these decisions that are being made, right? Do they benefit as many people as possible, right? Remember, or does it only benefit a particular group of constituents? That's what the logic about discussing democracy is about, right? Okay, and the final point is that what are the potential dangers related to delegation of power? Okay, so these are the basic ideas that you would want to target when you are writing your answer. That means no matter how you structure your exam answer, I've given you a rough outline in the second part of this slide to tell you, okay, this is roughly how you should structure your exam answer. It's a typical way of structuring exam answers, all right? Because for this topic, the questions are kind of typical. Even if you see the phrasing changes, right, you would realize that the gist of what they're asking you more or less remains the same. Okay, all right. So typically you should explain, number one, what are independent institutions, right? So you could explain from the get-go. That means the question asks you write your answer based either on independent courts or independent central banks, right? So you start off your discussion by basically saying, okay, I choose to focus my answer either on the courts or on the banks, and then subsequently explain what is the meaning of independent court, and then go on to talk about the theoretical aspect of delegation of power, right? So why is delegation to independent institutions necessary? Then subsequently, what are the different concerns or issues associated with it, like the principal agent framework and policy drift that I'm going to discuss with you, and then go on to the examples. So this is typically the way, if I was writing the exam answer, I would follow this structure. Basically, the structure of exactly how I'm going to discuss it with you in the lecture notes is how your answer should look like. Of course, a condensed version, right? But that is basically the structure that I would expect to see, and that the marker would more or less expect to see. I mention this not because this is my style of writing. It's really nothing to do with style. It's really to do with how to condense and make all of this information make sense, number one. Number two, you want to have that flow, right? So the logical, I always think, when I read an answer, when I read an essay, right, I always like to look at it in terms of logic and flow, right? This, you explain this concept A first, then you move on to concept B, because concept A is related to concept B, right? And then you have that logical flow, and it makes it easy for the marker to read. The moment the marker, and this happens with me sometimes when I, read, students' answers, or when I read journal articles, right, they are very complex. When the moment you have to go back to the beginning again and say, like, hey, what was it that they were actually trying to explain? And then there's this confusion there, right? That means there's something wrong with the flow already. If I have to go back and double check what your thesis statement is, and then see whether it is corresponding to your arguments, right? That means there's a contradiction somewhere along the argument. And you do not want that for your final exam. You want your answer to be straightforward, clear, right? Something that was told to me many years ago. When you write an answer, it should almost be like as if you can hear, sorry. Okay, wait. It should almost be a case, right, where you can almost like hear the person speaking to you. That's the logic down here. Okay? All right, so that's how, the clarity of your answer really should be like. Let me just read out a couple of exam questions to you so you can see what I'm talking about, right? Okay, say for example, one of the exam questions was, does the risk of policy drift undermine value of delegation to unelected elites in a democracy? So that means they're asking you, right? Policy drift is related to the dangers associated with delegating power away. So they're asking you, does this risk of these dangers, right, the policy drift, right, does it, right, undermine the value of delegation? That means, is it worth it or not to delegate power away? So they're asking you basically to evaluate, right? They're asking you to say, is, delegation of power good or bad? That's the basic idea behind that question. We look at another question. Delegation to unaccountable elites reduces the quality of democracy. Again, that is an evaluation that they're asking you for. They're asking you, if you delegate power away, right, to unaccountable elites. Basically, if you're unaccountable, remember I asked you that question just now, are these independent judges and these independent central bankers, right, are they accountable to the individual voter? Can the individual voter vote them out? Cannot, right? So therefore, they're not directly accountable to the individual voter. Am I right? All right. So the rationale they're asking, what they're actually asking you, right, is that, does this reduce the quality of democracy? Can you see? How does this impact policy making? Right? Does this make it a scenario where you are allowing, unfettered decision making by these unaccountable, independent bankers and independent judges, right, to make decisions? And does this negatively impact, right, the quality of democracy? Can you see? The phrasing of the question is different, but what they're actually asking you to talk about is more or less the same. Both the questions, are different, right? Am I right? It sounds totally different. Delegation to unaccountable elites. Basically, instead of saying independent institutions, right, they change the word and they say unaccountable elites. And if you are not familiar with all of these different iterations, when you look at the exam question, you're like, what is this, man? Right? I don't remember reading anything about unaccountable elites. But actually, they're all referring to the same thing, right? You understand the logic down here? So it is important for you to understand what they're actually asking you. And you will realize when you look at all the different kinds of questions related to this topic, right, it all is basically in the same direction. Okay? Are we clear on this one? Are we very clear on the basic structure, the basic idea? All right? Okay, now that you look at this, right, where we look at the material, right, it should hopefully all fall in place for you, right, as we go along. Okay? All right? Okay. Okay. So when you talk about independent institutions, non-elected institutions, right, these unaccountable elites and all of these, different iterations, right, basically what should you convey to the marker, right? That means the basic elements of explaining what these non-elected institutions are about, right, is that in the first place, should they be politicized or not? No. Right, that's why I asked you that question just now about the politicization of the appointment, right? So they should be free from political interference, right? Okay, but I'll explain why they should be free from political interference, right? Increasingly, they are quite popular, but not to say that it's a new phenomenon. Yeah, Asad? Huh? How can we make them? Okay, I'm going to explain that. That's what the topic is basically about. Oh yeah, I'll come to that when we talk about the policy drift and so on. Okay, all right, okay. So they should be free from political interference, right? Okay, that means they technically should not be politicized, right? And when we say free from political interference, means once power has been delegated from the elected politicians to these non-elected institutions, right? The logic is that these non-elected institutions should operate based, and when they operate, when I say operate, that means they make policy and so on. They should be able to make policy based on what? Based on their discretion, based on their technical expertise. That means that's the reason why I am asking you to do the job. I'm asking you to do the job because you, as the independent banker, central banker, or you as the independent judge or the independent court, you have the judicial expertise that I, as an elected politician, need not necessarily have. Right? Our politicians, is it a foregone conclusion that all elected politicians should have knowledge on how to interpret law, right? Some of them are economists, some of them are lawyers, right? Some of them have got military background and so on, right? So there's they have different levels of expertise in different areas. So the logic is that it's free from political interference because I let you do the job because you are basically the best person to do the job. That's the whole idea behind it, right? Okay. Of course, this is a little bit problematic in real life, right? We'll look at it in a little while, right? So your classic examples are, of course, in this syllabus, the independent courts and independent central banks. I would highly recommend, right, when you answer questions on this topic, please do not stray away from the independent courts and the independent central banks, even if the question does not specify to you. That means, if the question just says delegation to unaccountable elites reduces the quality of democracy, full stop, discuss. That means they didn't tell you, right, that they want you to discuss either with reference to central banks or either with reference to the courts, right? But I would not recommend you, right, straying away from either discussing the courts or the central banks, right, and doing your own thing because that is what is examined in the syllabus. We more or less, largely, follow what is indicated in the syllabus, okay? Right? Yeah, correct, Jean. Jean is correct, right? When it says it should be free, right? So that was the emphasis down there, right? It should be free, right? But unfortunately, we do not always see, this lack of politicization, right? But sometimes, right, there is a justification for the politicization also, right? So I need you to be on board with me in having a fluid understanding of the delegation of power, right? That means, yeah, you delegate power for a particular reason because you want it to be depoliticized. You want it to be free from political interference. But is there a danger in allowing total independence by these unaccountable elites, right? So that is where that balance in your answer should be reflected. That means your answer should have that balance. That means you should acknowledge, right, the limitations of delegating power, right? And you should also acknowledge the limitations of politicization at the same time. Okay? All right? Okay, let's move on. All right. Okay, so let's look at the importance of non-elected institutions, right? Okay, so when you look at independent institutions, when you look at this chart down here, right? Okay, the logic down here that basically you want to explain is that why is it that you want to have independent institutions? Why do you want to place a constraint on politicians? Why is it important, right, to basically have checks and balances on politicians, right? Why is it that we say we want to prevent politicians from taking tempting actions? Why? Yeah, just go ahead. Why? Mm-hmm. 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 Okay, all right. Mm-hmm. 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 Okay, one, they don't have expertise. Okay, fine. Okay, okay. What else? Okay, they could make wrong decisions. Okay, so basically, what does this boil down to then? If they can make wrong decisions, number one, right? Or they make decisions that did you use the word populist? Did I hear you say populist? Yeah. If they make decisions that are populist in nature, what does this boil down to? We have discussed this with in relation to the nature of politicians before. What do we sometimes say about how politicians behave? What motivates politicians? Say again? Office seeking. What's the logic? Correct. What's the logic behind office seeking? Power. What's the other two? They're motivated by prestige, income, power, and prestige, right? They want to enjoy the spoils of office. That's why we get the logic of office seeking. Correct? Right. Yeah. So that's the rationale down here, right? You basically could have notice how I'm phrasing it. I didn't say politicians are office seeking. Notice I'm balancing my answer. I don't want to get myself into trouble, right? So you have politicians who may be motivated by income, power, prestige. They may be motivated to engage in policy making or take actions, right, that would help them. Yeah, this idea of gaining power, you want the direct benefits and so on, right? Why do you want these benefits? What is your end goal? What is the goal of politicians? What are they interested in? Election, re-election, correct? Election and re-election, correct? So the logic is that they want to gain votes. If they want to gain votes, right, basically what do they need to do? They need to appeal to their constituents. And your office-seeking politicians will appeal to as many constituents as possible, or they will tend to appeal to that group of constituents that they think that can help them gain office. Right, so that means I can appeal to a particular group of constituents. Say, for example, I may be interested in appealing to business constituents who I know they're very powerful. Right, I know they'll be able to swing the vote or sway the vote, and they they will back me up, right? I scratch their back, they scratch my back, right? And they'll back me up and they'll support my policy making actions and so on, right? If they in return, if I give them contracts and so on, right? So that's the whole logic behind the idea of preventing them from taking tempting actions. And right, logic is this: if you have politicians who are office seeking, if they're interested in gaining and maintaining power, if they're interested in things like re-election, votes from a particular group of constituents, right? In the run up to elections, what kind of policies may you likely see in the run up to elections? What kind of policies can you think of a scenario, right, that that we see in the run up to elections that politicians tend to engage in? Huh? Lower taxation. Why? Huh? They want to what? Sorry. Right. Correct. So the logic is that I give you things like pre-election goodies, right? Like your subsidies, your welfare. Suddenly you've got GST. Oh, sorry. Suddenly you've got vouchers. Suddenly you've got vouchers. Suddenly you've got goodies that are being given to you, promises to cut taxes and so on. And logic is this: may these, okay, say for example, let's use the lowering of taxes, right? In the case of the economy, right? may lowering of taxes necessarily be healthy? May not necessarily be healthy, right? Because if you lower taxes, what is lowering taxes basically do? What does lowering taxes basically do? Right, lowers government income. It taxes translates into revenue for government, right? And what does this revenue do? This revenue goes on to fund your public projects, right? Your public goods and services. So if I'm going to cut taxes, right, those that are, of course, people are going to be happy lah, because in the short term, right, lowering taxes is going to be beneficial to me because I've got more disposable income in my hand, right? But in the long term, is it beneficial to the health of the economy? Technically, not necessarily, correct? Yeah. So that's the logic. So you know this point down here about tempting actions, right? That could be a tempting action because I want to appeal to the populace. I want to appeal to the voters or the electorate, right? And at that point, does it matter whether this policy is going to be healthy in the long term or in the short term? I go ahead and make this electoral promise, and people say, "Wow, lower taxes, you're giving me welfare subsidies, all of these goodies that you're giving me. Okay, I work for you." Then subsequently, who is going to bear the brunt of these ill-conceived policies in the long run? The citizens themselves, right? That's the rationale down here, right? So in this case, right? Yeah, correct, Gwyneth, right? So in this case, right, they want to, the importance of independent institutions is to prevent these kinds of, detrimental policy decisions being made by politicians who may be motivated by office-seeking tendencies. You understand the logic? So you allow those. Can you see the phrase down there in the what's that? Right-hand side of the diagram, allow those who are not susceptible to political incentives to make decisions, right? Because these are the political incentives, right? I want to gain income, power, and prestige, and this is what motivates me to make particular promises to citizens, right? So this is the first starting point. This is where things can go wrong, right? If you allow your elected politicians who may have office-seeking tendencies to make all of these decisions. But if I give the decision-making, power to an independent institution, right? Is the independent central bank or the independent court going to be concerned whether the people are liking them and going to vote for them subsequently? No, right? So the logic is that we assume in an ideal scenario, right, that these independent institutions are not subject to these same problems, of taking tempting actions. We assume that these independent institutions, right, are not those who are susceptible to making political incentives. They're not susceptible to political incentives in making decisions. That's the rationale down here. Okay. All right. So that's the logic down here, right? So institutions cannot absolutely prevent an undesirable outcome, right? We cannot ensure a desirable outcome, right? Because it really depends on, which are the type of politicians, which are the type of, decision makers you have, right? But the way that we can think more carefully about, making decisions probable, some, less likely, which is the way to ensure that, we are going in the correct direction of making decisions, is to think about how carefully we allocate decision-making authority. That is what that statement by Kuckerman, right, basically is referring to, right? So the logic is that when you have independent or non-elected institutions, what are you basically doing? You're increasing the chances. Look at the terminology being used, right? That means we're saying that we are reducing the chances of politicians taking tempting decisions. We're reducing the chances of politicians catering to populist tendencies. We're reducing the chances of politicians making short-term decisions that may be very unhealthy to the economy or may be unhealthy to the polity, right? But the rationale is that, when you depoliticize, I like that word. I also like the other word, insulated from political pressure. That's a very good phrase to use for this topic because you are basically, insulating it from political pressure. You're preventing a decision from being tainted by unscrupulous politicians, right? Okay, you are removing it from the political cycle, right? So the logic down here really is that, we tend to make assumptions. We tend to make assumptions that politicians are evil, correct? That's why I use that word may, right, you may have politicians or office seeking. We tend to assume, before elections, they look like this, right? The image down there that I have, the graphic down there, right? Before elections, they have that Puss in Boots look, right? After elections, they get all mean and, evil because they're already in power already. They don't care about what you think. I'm already in power for the next 5 years. I'll do whatever I want to do, right? Okay, we make this assumption. Okay, so can you please underline the word assumption? Please underline the word assumption because that is what is going to help you to explain the rationale that it's not a case where 100% your independent institutions are also going to be extremely good. It's not a case 100% that every single politician is motivated by income, power, and prestige. Is it true that every single politician is only office seeking? Remember, we said that there's a scenario where you have politicians that may be more inclined to be office seeking, or they may be more inclined to be policy seeking. If you're going to be 100% office seeking, right? In the next round of elections, citizens already know that you're office seeking. You're only making populist decisions. You will still die at the hands of the voter, correct? Unless your voters are crazy, right? Which voters are crazy sometimes, right? And then they keep repeatedly voting for unscrupulous politicians. It happens in some polities, right? Depending on the scenario. But the logic is that most of the time you find that this is simply an assumption. Okay, all right. So that's what you need to think about, right? Non-elected institutions, right? They should or they will always act in favor or interest of the citizenry and the country vis-a-vis politicians, right? We got to hold on to this assumption to play around with it subsequently. Okay, are everybody clear on the logic so far that we've discussed? Okay, all clear? Any questions? Okay, all right. Okay, just now when Asad was talking about the courts and the judges and so on, right? And I talked about this logic of appointment. This appointment is extremely important, right? Because the whole logic, right, is that if you are claiming, okay, please pay attention to this part here, all right, because you're going to apply this logic subsequently to the logic of the independent bankers, right, and the independent central bank, in UK, right, and also looking at the logic of the judges and so on, right. So this part is very important. I would think that every single exam answer that discusses this topic, right, would have at least a couple of lines relating to this argument on appointment. Okay, so you can have a so-called independent institution. You claim that it's independent, but if you claim that it's independent, then the appointment also should be depoliticized, right? So if you claim that you are appointed by political masters, then it would definitely reduce level of independence and it will increase the likelihood of politicization, because the logic is that, right, that when you have political interference in terms of appointment, right, they will be those that are being appointed will be inclined, right, to basically fulfill the wishes, the agenda of those that appointed them, right? And if they're political masters, then they would be inclined towards the agenda of the political, masters, right? So, you claim that it is okay. We have an independent appointment committee. Fine. Who appoints those that are in the independent appointment committee? Right. Right. So okay, let's just use if you were reading all the controversies related to, remember the logic of the what was it called? The one that they had the inquiry recently, the Parliamentary Privileges Committee of what? Sorry, Committee of Privileges, right? And then they say, oh, this one is supposed to be independent. You've got members from the different political parties sitting on it, but at the end of the day, did you really see directing everything? Where were they from, right? And in the end, I was eagerly following the whole discussion, and I was kind of disappointed that I haven't heard anything about it subsequently. But if you read some of your Instagram accounts, like Wake Up Singapore, for instance, right? They were busy pointing out, this one just looks like one political party versus another political party because of the composition of the committee and so on, right? So that's the rationale down here, right? If you claim and I'm just using that, as an illustration about the composition of, a composition of a commission or a committee and so on, right? So you look at, the composition of the committee and so on. Where do they come from, right? If at the end of the day they are still appointed by, political masters, then of course there's indirect influence. Indirect influence is still technically influence. Am I right? That's the rationale down here, right? So, you claim that it is independent, but it's not entirely independent at the end of the day, right? So, and even if you have, the independent appointers, right? Maybe they appoint themselves, out of a body, say like, for example, you've got, a lawyers association or, and then they say, okay, we will choose, the judges based on, our own, like we vote for the, the best, candidates that we think, would make, very good, judges and so on. Fine. Good. Okay, fine. Right. But do we really know how these independent, actors also are thinking? Maybe they may also have got, some particular affiliations. So my question, the whole point about talking about this here is to highlight to you, when we say that these independent institutions are independent, really, at the end of the day, how independent are they actually? Right? Can you actually gauge and say, yeah, this judge, right, is totally 100% independent. He's totally 100% free from any kind of political interference. He's totally insulated. Can we make that statement with 100% assurance? Can we? We can't. Right? Because either they may be, indirectly influenced by politicians, right, who indirectly, appoint them. They may be directly, influenced, if you have, direct appointment, or they may have their own affiliations that they don't declare, right? You may have, a supposedly independent judge that is actually a pro-political party A. Another judge is pro-political party B. Can we actually tell? We can't actually tell, right? At the end of the day, this is an important point to keep in mind. Can you please write down there this logic of appointment, right? And what exactly their affiliations are and so on, right? This is important to keep in mind when we discuss the logic of policy drift, which I'm going to come to in a little while, right? The policy drift, okay? Okay, are we clear? Yeah? All right. Policy drift. Policy drift, right? It's in the slides, Asad. Are you okay? Yeah, okay. No, because you are looking here, so I'm thinking that, yeah, okay. No, I just thought that you didn't understand the point. Okay, here, wait, let me see where I want to stop before I let you off for the break. Okay, let me just do this one slide, all right, and then we talk about the principal agent framework when we come back from the break, okay? All right, okay. So look, this one here, when we talk about the appointment, okay, what you want to highlight down here, right, is that, it is best to understand the logic of independence of an institution, right, again, along a continuum, right? So rather than to say it is independent and it is not independent, which would suggest that an institution may be 100% independent and 100% not independent, because that's basically what independent versus non-independent refers to, right? I think, right, that the idea about independence, right, should be better understood whether they are more independent, becoming more independent, becoming less independent, right, or increasingly independent, increasingly not independent, and so on. So using it on a continuum is actually basically more useful to explain. Number two, why we always like to use this logic of independence, logic of continuum, with regards to independence, because, right, if you have the appointment of the independent central bankers, the appointment of the independent judges, right, are they there for life? Not necessarily, right? So appointments of these individual actors, they can change, right? The degree of independence can be altered depending on the government of the day, which kind of politicians come in, like, what Asad mentioned just now. The government of the day in Turkey basically has responded in, either, a combination of, a response to populist policies as well as a lack of economic or financial expertise, for example, and that has resulted in a particular policy outcome regarding the strength of the Turkish lira, right? So it can be, a case where this degree of independence changes according to the government of the day, according to which political party comes into power, right? It can also be a case where it changes according to the institutions, right, and the kinds of decisions that they're looking at. If you look at the case of the euthanasia in Netherlands, right? Initially, euthanasia was actually illegal in Netherlands, right? And it meant that what that suggested to you is that the politicians and the government had more control, right, over how law regarding euthanasia is interpreted, right? And subsequently, the courts began to take a more and more distinct stance regarding euthanasia by acquitting doctors who had performed euthanasia on particular patients. And they kept justifying and providing reasons. Why is it that we interpreted the law such? It's illegal, but you are acquitting doctors, right, from performing, euthanasia. So you started to see the courts becoming more and more independent, right? And eventually, it was so independent that the government had little choice but to say, okay, we'll change the law. And euthanasia is now legal, right? Of course, with some conditions in Netherlands. And it has taken root in Europe in such a way that other states like Belgium and so on have also, right, implemented this logic of euthanasia. Now in Netherlands, they even say children, right, I think under 12 years old, they are also eligible for euthanasia, right, depending on the conditions, right? And it's a stark distinction, right, from when they first started off with euthanasia being illegal, right? So that's why the logic of, moving along this continuum of more independent and less independent is actually a more useful take, right, on this logic of, the extent and degree of independence. Before we go for the lunch break, look at the question that I've got on this slide. Answer this question for me, right, or discuss it with me, and then we go for the lunch break. Total elimination of political influence may also not be desirable. That means, to have a totally independent, central bank or totally independent court, right? That means these institutions are totally independent, 100% insulated, may not be desirable. Why? Why do you think so? Anybody got any reasons? Governments would have no control over how laws are created and bills are passed, okay? So what? You're correct. Push the argument. So what? So what if government has got no control? It will not be aligned. Okay, it will not be aligned with citizens' preferences. Okay, fine. All right. What else? What else? Anything else? Anything else? If it's not aligned, with citizens' preferences, then what is the outcome of that? If policies are not aligned with citizens' preferences, what is the outcome of that? Policies are not not beneficial, they're not representative. Okay, all right. Independent courts might have too much power and interpreting any laws whatever they want due to no constraints. Yeah, okay, this is a good point that Jean has mentioned, right? Okay. The logic is this, when you look at the interpretation of law, right? Okay. When the courts are interpreting law based on this one particular issue, remember last week when we looked at decentralization and I showed you that graphic of the helicopter view versus the little map with the little pin on the map? Do you remember that graphic that we looked at? What was the rationale of discussing that? What was the rationale of discussing that? Similar logic. What's the rationale of discussing that? The big picture versus. Please don't tell me big picture versus small picture. Big picture versus what? Yeah, okay, correct. So, but what was the rationale behind that discussion? Big picture versus what? Something that is immediate. Yeah, correct. Micro view versus the macro view, right? So the logic here, when you talk about the big picture, who is the one who is which actor is the one that is concerned with formulating policy that correlates or corresponds to the big picture? Government, right? Government. Okay, now, okay, let's move away from the decentralization logic. So it's government, right? Okay. Then what about the courts in this case? They are only interpreting the law, right, based on that one particular incident, correct? So they may have a more narrow interpretation because they're only looking at what's happening at that particular point. But how does this have precedent, or how does this have an impact on, say, other issues? So, for example, when you look at, say, for example, you look at law, right? Is it only related to that one particular concept or one particular issue? It may be related to something else. Say, for example, housing law. Okay, let's just use this example, right? Housing law may be related to things like fraud on stamp duty, right? It may be related to things, related to how much loans people can take out, right? So that is a financial or a macroeconomic logic, right? It has to do with, financial stability. It also has to do with, housing law has to do with demographics, right? Has to do with, the size of the population. If you look at recent Singapore law relating to, housing, right? There was this big hoo-ha about, how people, certain blocks of flats or in in certain areas can only be purchased, or they're only allocated to people with families, right? So if you're single, or if you've got no kids and so on, then automatically you're cut out of this, right? So it's related to demographics also. But somebody who brings this issue to the court may be only looking at it from one perspective. But that one issue of housing, right, is related to so many other different areas, correct? Right. So this is the rationale down here. So if you have total independence and total insulation, right, you may have a more micro view, right, taken when they're interpreting the law or interpreting, the policy and so on, right? Okay. And at the end of the day, also, related to this logic, right, is that, if you are, going to, think about it as, you need to have total elimination of political influence, you're assuming, you're assuming that in all scenarios, politicians will always be like this, the evil politician after elections. Is this true? Is it true that, your politicians are always evil, right, and your independent institutions are always going to be, angelic and, make decisions that are in the best interest for all citizens? This is an assumption that is made. Remember, that's why I talked about it just now. It's an assumption. It's not always true, right? It's not always true to say that, every single politician, right, is, evil, is only going to make decisions based on income, power, and prestige, right? It's not entirely true, right? So that's an assumption that we need to turn on its head. Okay? All right, everybody clear on this logic down here? Okay, let's take the lunch break right now. It is what time? It is 1:03. Can you come back by about latest? Cannot come back any later than 1:20. All right, latest 1:20. Okay, can? All right, go. Right, you're back already? Can we continue? All right. Okay, let's continue. All right. Okay, so now I want to discuss the principal agent framework. Okay. Okay. So can you please indicate there, right, in your notes, okay, if you're writing an exam answer on this topic, you have to refer to the principal agent framework. I have looked at papers, answers from students before who do not indicate or include any discussion on the principal agent framework, right? I do not understand how you can write an answer on this topic without referring to this, because this is basically central. It's key to helping to explain the relationship between politicians and independent institutions. That is basically what this entire discussion, on delegation of power is about. It's about the relationship, right, between the politicians and independent actors. If you do not explain or discuss principal agent framework, then you cannot discuss reasons for delegation. If you do not discuss principal agent framework and reasons for delegation, then you cannot discuss policy drift, right? Because the principal agent framework is the one that explains, right, how the agent, right, which is the independent institution or the independent actor, acts using the delegated powers. So if powers are being delegated to the agent, what happens when the agent, right, does not behave accordingly, right, to what the principal actually had in mind, right? So how do you explain? That's basically what policy drift is about. How do you explain, right, this discrepancy that arises, right, if you do not talk about the principal agent framework? What sometimes happens with students, right, is that they discuss the principal agent framework without mentioning that it is the principal agent framework. I mean, they sort of like, explain what happens in the relationship between the politicians and independent actors, but they never ever use the phrase principal agent framework. We need to see the word principal agent framework and an explanation of this framework, because this is the theory or the concept that underscores, right, this chapter or this topic. You understand? Okay. All right. So that is, important down here. So the principal and agent, very simple. Just remember, right? The principal is like, the main actor, the main person, right? Okay. So the main person in this case is the elected politician, right? And the elected politician is able to, has got the legitimacy and the mandate that is bestowed on them, right, as a result of being voted in, right? So the electorate is the one that gives the authority to the elected politicians. And the elected politicians then govern, right, using this public authority, right? Okay. So in this case, the principal, right, now takes this authority, this public authority that has been given to him or her by the voters, right? Because they were voted in. So that's how we understand that, they were given the authority, right? Okay. They take this authority and they give it, delegate it to the agent, who is the independent institution or the independent actor, the non-elected institution, unelected actor, whichever you want to refer to it, unaccountable, elites, and so on, right? So basically, the agent, where do they get, how are they empowered? They're empowered. How do they govern? They use the delegated powers. If I take power and I give it to you and I ask you, go and do XYZ, right? The logic here is that whatever that you are doing, right, should actually benefit the principal. Because I take my power and give it to you, right? That means there's a particular function that I expect you to fulfill. Correct? I have a particular agenda. I cannot do it, or I am unable to do it, or I rather you do it because you have the technical expertise, right? And you're doing it on behalf of me. If you're doing it on behalf of me, right, Does it mean that you can do anything you want to do? No, that's not the rationale here. That is why at the end of this slide, right, you notice delegation must benefit the principal or be in the principal's interest. If I, as the elected politician, right, tell the independent court or the independent bank, right? Say, for example, I tell the independent bank, please ensure that you formulate monetary policy and the interest rates remain stable, right? That's my goal, right? My goal is for monetary policy to be stable. My goal as a politician is for taxation rates, right, to be stable as well, right, beneficial. And what are you as the agent supposed to do? You're supposed to work, uh, towards that goal, right? The way you go about doing so, or you may have a particular reason for tweaking the taxation rate, right? Or making some recommendations based on your expertise, your technical expertise, and your assessment, right, of how taxation should function at that point. But the end logic is that you are told to do something, right? And it technically should be in the interest of the principal, or it must benefit the principal, right? When it doesn't benefit the principal, when it is very far removed from the principal's interest, that is what we refer to as policy drift. That means they have drifted away. That's the whole logic. They've drifted away from what the intention behind the policy basically refers to. Okay, then when you discuss, right, the principal agent framework, right, you must be able to explain why, right, this delegation occurred. That means, why do you have this scenario where the principal who uses the public authority to delegate power takes this power, delegates it to the agent, and the agent, governs using this delegated power, right? Why does that even occur? So there are a couple of reasons, right? When you look at the reasons, some of these reasons are mutually related. That means, they're interconnected. Okay, let's look at some of these reasons. Say, for example, the first one, let's go from a clockwise direction, okay? So you look at the first one, which is protect policies from short-term change, right? Basically, the logic of insulation from power, right? So similar to the argument on policy stability. Remember, we talked about policy stability, right? And what is policy stability about? The inability to change policy. And policy stability sometimes it's actually a good thing, correct? Right? Because, if you are having policies that are being arbitrarily changed, if they are being changed, because elected politician is trying to hijack the policy making process, or a particular actor is trying to hijack the policy making process to benefit himself or benefit his own constituents, then do you want policy to be changing? Right? You don't want policy to be changing, especially if policy is already working, right? Why are you changing something that is risky when it's actually already working? If it's not broken, why are you trying to fix it? Correct? That's the logic down here. So, for example, if you think about it, sometimes, remember what we discussed just now, sometimes politicians can behave in a myopic manner. You know what's myopia? Myopic, short-sightedness, right? So sometimes some of these decisions that these politicians make, right, they may reflect myopia in the sense that they're only looking at the short-term benefits, right, that may be associated with that particular policy. They want to, cajole the voters, and they want to, gain votes so that they can basically, enter into office to enjoy income, power, and prestige, right? So, for example, they, want to make particular policies, that would help them to win votes, right? So, for example, reduce the number of asylum seekers. I'm a populist politician. I say we should not allow, these asylum seekers to come into the country because they're going to be a burden on our infrastructure. But in the long term, what does that basically highlight? It highlights, not respecting the UNDP. It highlights the idea of, you're restricting human rights, all right? You're not respecting human rights, you're restricting rights, because it is the right of an asylum seeker or a refugee, it's the right of a refugee to apply for asylum, right? And, seek asylum in a state, right? So, an independent court may, in this scenario, be better able to make a decision relating to this, because they would consider what does it mean for what is a refugee, what does it mean for asylum seeking, how would this reflect on the state's commitment. Say, for example, if they've signed a treaty with an international body, if they are party to the UNHCR, for instance, right? Denying, asylum seekers entry into your state, how would that contravene a treaty that you've already signed, right? So that would be something that would lie under the jurisdiction and the expertise of independent court. Whereas a politician, an elected politician, may be thinking, think about the burden that asylum seekers or refugees can place on the infrastructure, or these refugees are all coming from a particular ethnic culture or a particular religion. And I know that, the citizens are kind of frustrated, or they are worried about the dilution of culture in their country, or they're worried about the threat of a particular ethnic group. Maybe they're racist or they're xenophobic or whatever. That's a prevalent sentiment in that country. And they say that, okay, let's, put out this statement during the election so that I will appeal to these constituents, right? So it's a short-sighted and myopic, kind of a policy that these politicians, may basically come up with, right? Okay, so that's one example. Credible commitment to policy. That's another, example that you can look at, right? So sometimes, what happens is that, a policy that an elected politician may want to put forth may be slightly at odds with what they had promised during an election, right? But that policy that they now need to put forth maybe is necessary given a particular, scenario that has arisen in the state. So basically, what happens is that, if it's at odds with the general party platform, they do not want other politicians, or they do not want the electorate to turn around and say, but I thought, we were on a different page with regards to this particular policy angle. So if they, refer, or they allow independent institution to make a similar decision. That means they say that, the independent institution is making this decision and we support this decision, right? That lends a bit of credibility to that policy. It suggests to the electorate that it's not just a scenario where the elected politicians are flip-flopping on their decisions, flip-flopping on their, election manifesto. But, even the independent court, even the independent central bank, believes that this is the direction to move based on this particular scenario that you're facing in the country. And therefore, it is not a case where, the elected politicians are willy-nilly changing policy direction just, to suit a particular scenario, or to, gain some kind of benefit. So it lends credibility, to a particular policy direction. The third one, use of experts in policy making. This one is actually related, right, to the next point, which is about reduced workload and increased efficient decision making. So these two are connected to each other. The use of experts, right, and the reducing of workload, I would say that they're quite closely connected to each other. So the use of experts in decision, in policy making, basically the idea of reducing information asymmetries. The idea here is, like what I pointed out earlier on. Politicians, elected politicians, right? They may not be experts in every single policy area, right? So delegation of power, right, to an independent institution may be beneficial in the sense that you allow the real experts to make the real decisions, right? Rather than I make a decision that is half-baked, or I make a decision that is not necessarily going to be beneficial because I do not have enough information or enough expertise, right? That is why, for example, the civil service, right, or in your public admin officials, right, they are what we refer to as the institutional memory of the, the particular ministry. Because, you find that your civil servants, or your these non-elected, public servants, right, they are there for a longer period of time as opposed to your politicians. Some politicians come and go, right? 5 years they are there, and then they're not there. But whereas your civil service, when they make policy decisions, right, they make policy decisions based on expertise. Number one. On number two, they make decisions based on past decisions. They go and look up. Okay, this particular scenario, it occurred, in 1985. What was our decision back in 1985? 1992, same thing happened again. 95, the same thing happened again. How did our decisions look like back then? what was the conditions, what was the terms, right, and how do we make our decisions. So basically what we refer to as institutional memory, right? So they basically have got the expertise, right? They make decisions based on their discretion. Can you please write that down? Based on their discretion. Discretion. Let me type it out. Discretion. Wait, how do you spell? Decision. How do you spell decisions? Yes. How do you spell decision? Why is it I cannot spell decision all of a sudden? Okay, it's written down there in the CI. Thank you. Oh my goodness. Decision making based on discretion. Discretion. Okay. All right. Okay. Then related to that point is about reducing workload, increasing efficient decision making, right? So the rationale is that when you delegate power away to these technical, experts, or what we refer to as technocrats, right? Okay, bureaucrats, technocrats, right? So these technocrats, they would have, the precision, the expertise, and so on. If they have the precision, they have the expertise, they know how to make these decisions, they'll be able to make decisions more efficiently. So it is cost efficient, right? It is time efficient as well, right? Okay, so that is the logic down here. Instead of the politicians thinking how do we approach this issue, and then they convene a committee of experts, and then they discuss. Then the one eye is the king among the blind. Everybody also don't know what to do, but just anyhow go along with the flow, right? So the logic is that if you pass it on to the experts, right, they will be able to make more efficient decision making. Last one, blame shifting. Okay, I would think that this is one of the more common reasons why they delegate power away, right? Blame shifting to the experts for unpopular policies. So elected politician knows a tax increase is actually vital to this particular scenario because the economy is flailing. So they have no choice but to say that they want to implement a tax increase. But they know if they tell citizens we need to hike taxes, like what we're experiencing in line with the GST hike, like for example, right? Is that something that citizens are going to be so readily welcoming with open arms? No, not necessarily, right? So it's an unpopular policy. So the elected politician is thinking, okay, if I say that we need to implement a GST hike or a hike in taxes, that is going to that's going to be to my detriment, right, as a politician, because citizens are going to say this government, right, couldn't manage its finances properly, and now is passing on the cost to the citizens and saying that a GST hike or a tax hike is necessary. But it so happens that a tax hike is necessary and it will be beneficial to the polity in the long run. But citizens may not necessarily think about that because, again, similar to like what we discussed, the macro and the micro, citizens may be thinking about my immediate situation. I'm not thinking about what's going to happen to the entire economy, right? 20 years from now. I'm thinking about how do I put food on my table for my children, right? Or for, how do I purchase a car? How do I finance my housing loan, right? How much, standard of living has gone up and so on. That's what citizens are going to be concerned about, right? But if I take this power, right, to make this policy and give it to an independent institution, and the central bank instead says, it is healthy and advisable to increase tax. Politician says, yes, okay, we'll increase tax because they are the ones who said it that we should do it. At the end of the day, when it comes to the next round of elections, the blow to the elected politician is softened because it wasn't the politician per se, right, who said that we need to increase taxes. It was the central bank who said it, right? So basically, finger point, right, and say, it's not me. They are the ones who said that we should do it, and we went along with their expert advice, right? So that's the rationale down there. Get policy pushed through, right? Even a harsh policy that they know citizens may not necessarily appreciate, right? Push it through, right? Without compromising on their own image, which will not hurt their re-election chances, right? You understand the logic down here? Are we clear on all the different, reasons for delegation, right? The last one, like blame shifting for, to experts for unpopular policies, right? Happens very often in the EU also, in the European Union. Anything that is not very popular, oh, it was passed down by the European Parliament, right? And they just shift the blame to the experts there. All right, okay, yeah, Lionel, you want, yeah, say again. Fauci, Fauci, uh-huh. Yeah, that the whole the COVID thing in the US was unnecessarily politicized, right? And as a result of that, 2 years later, right, they're still fighting over all of these things and trying to discredit each other, right? And in this case, yeah, what is the value of the independent institution in the sense that what's the value of the CDC, right, vis-a-vis the the elected politicians, right? And shifting blame for all of these unpopular policies, and pointing out whether the CDC basically has got its act together, and whether they are correct or not for making particular decisions and so on. Yeah, so that could be an example. But I'll be careful to use it in this context, right? Because in this case, I mean, for understanding purposes, you could use that. But for explaining, particularly in this exam question, you would refer to the banks and the okay. So looking at these reasons for delegation, right? Of course, we always want to make some kind of criticism, or we want to have a more comprehensive evaluation for these reasons for delegation. So looking at the reasons for delegation, right? Is it a case where you must, my question is, must you delegate power away? Can any of these be done, right, without actually delegating power away? That's my that's the take on this, right? So you want to evaluate, right? So could you possibly resolve all these problems in a different way? So for example, if you want to talk about increase the use of experts, right? Do you necessarily need to delegate power away to these unelected experts? Might you simply employ these technical experts in the government itself, like consultants, right? Or you outsource certain projects, or commission certain projects to particular agencies? Do you necessarily really have to delegate this power that has been bestowed to you, right, by the voters, right, to these unelected institutions, right? And then the other point down here about of taking blame for, avoid taking blame for unpopular policies. Okay, fine. Logic is this, right? If citizens are going to be, let's go back to the example of increasing taxes. Okay, all right. So very simple. Okay, your elected politicians can shift the blame to the central bank, all right, and say that central bank is the one that advised the increasing of taxes. Fine, all right. They avoid denting their own image, or they don't want to compromise their image. Fine, right. That makes sense. But at the end of the day, citizens are still going to be unhappy, correct? So wouldn't it make actually more sense, right? Rather than to delegate power away in order to, prevent their image from being damaged, right? Wouldn't it actually make more sense to actually educate the public as to why a rise in tax is actually necessary, and how this is going to work out, to the benefit of the citizenry in the long term? Because that's basically what your elected politicians are also supposed to do. They are, they are representatives of the citizens. They are making decisions on behalf of the citizens, right? So the logic is that, how does the blame shifting actually help the citizenry? Citizenry is still unhappy, right, at the end of the day, correct? How does it actually help? Only the politician escapes, largely unscathed, or somewhat unscathed, by the citizens who now, are still unhappy, but instead they're unhappy with the unelected institutions. But how does it actually contribute to long-term benefits for the entire polity, correct? So this is what you need to think about when you make these kind of arguments, right? Notice there's a lot of back and forth, there's a lot of ding-donging in these arguments, because basically what you want to highlight is the need for balance, right? So you say, oh, we delegate power away. These are all the benefits associated with delegating power away. What are the problems with delegating power? Can some of this be mitigated? Can we find an alternative to it or not? Right. So that means the whole point about this criticism down here, right, is that is there some way to mitigate the effects, right, of delegating power away? Is it always necessary in all scenarios, right? That is what you want to reflect with these criticisms, okay? And then the principal agent framework also, right, doesn't actually help us to identify what are all the range of options that are available. Politician has got power from the elected, but from being elected, takes power away, takes power and gives it, to the unelected institutions, right? But is there a consideration of what are all the various, possible, options that are available, and how do we come to this conclusion where delegation of power is the best of all possible solutions at the end of the day, right? So that is the main idea down here. So it ignores the choices, that politicians can make, right? And when politicians do make choices, they make these choices in a macro view, number one. Number two, they're thinking about the trajectory, they're thinking about history, they're thinking about, why do we make particular decisions? Say, for example, right, in Singapore, when you look at, anything to do with the management of race and religion in Singapore, right, where does this all stem from? It stems from what happened in the 1950s and the 1960s with the Maria Hertog riots, with the race riots of 1964, correct? These are the precedents that have been set. And or when you look at management, or when you look at management of race and religion, and a firm commitment to things like meritocracy, right? Where does this come from? This comes from meritocracy, pragmatism. Where does this come from? It comes from the fact that there was a large difference between how Malaya back then in the 1960s was thinking about governing the state versus Singapore, who said we want a state for Singaporeans. We want a state like a Malaya for all Malayans, rather than Indian, Malay, Chinese kind of a logic, right? So no race-based politics, right? So these kinds of things, when politicians make decisions, they may be influenced by a variety of factors, and this delegation of power in the principal agent framework sort of ignores all of these different reasons why, or motivations, for for politicians making decisions. We basically zoom into the fact that politicians may not have expertise, politicians may not have the time. They want to delegate power away so they don't compromise their image, but they want to force unpopular policies. But is that all there is to decision making? Because you're looking at it from a very narrow perspective. You're looking at it from the perspective that politicians either make bad decisions because they are appealing to populist tendencies, or you're basically saying that politicians make decisions and are afraid of the backlash that they may receive from the electorate. Are these two things, right, or these three things, the main elements to decision making in a polity? Not necessarily, right? So that is why the principal agent framework, right, is slightly problematic, and we need to critique it. Notice, it is a scenario where we are trying to balance the argument. We're looking at reasons for delegation. We're looking at what else can we do apart from delegation. So coming to the conclusion that is delegation in all scenarios always the best option. That's what all of this criticism comes down to, right? Okay, you understand the logic down here? All right. Then, the logic down here, right, when we talk about the transfer of authority, right? Okay, this is where you want to talk about the policy drift, right? The other criticism, right? So, what happens after delegation, right? This principal agent framework and this delegation of power rests on the assumption, right, that the agent, that means the independent institution or the unelected institution, is always going to make the best decision possible. That is going to make the decision, right, the policy decision in the interest of the principal. It is going to reflect, what the needs and the wants of the polity are. They're making this decision based on their technical expertise. But remember just time we talked about the appointment, and appointment may be politicized, number one. Number two, the agent may have their own agenda as well, and may shift away from the ideal point, or shift away from the interest of the principle of the elected politician. right? So in this case, right, are we investing too much faith in the agent? That's the main question. Are we saying that yeah, the agent, the unelected institution is the best actor to make this decision. They are going to always do a proper job, but they may have their own agenda, and this is where you get the logic of the policy drift, right? They use their discretion to implement policies nearer to their own preferences. And if they're making decisions, that is closer to their own preferences, can we guarantee that these decisions that they're making are going to be extremely beneficial to society? Not necessarily, right? Okay, so this is the problem down here, right? Okay, this diagram down here shows you where things can go wrong, how things can go wrong, right? So the agent, that means, remember, the agent is the unelected institution or the independent institution. The agent may not reveal their true preferences. Maybe they have got their own hidden agenda. They may have their own hidden agenda, right? They may be working covertly, with a particular politician or a particular opposition politician, a particular political party. They can be even, subject to subversion and working, with an external foreign actor even, right? So they may have their own, preferences and so on, right? So that's, quite negative. Second, the one on the left, right? The agent captured by powerful private interests, right? That one is also quite negative in nature, right? Why? Because, the agent, we say that, the elected politician may, we want to, let me rephrase that. We want to depoliticize decision making and remove the elected politician from making tempting decisions. Remember, we said that at the beginning of the discussion, right? Remove them from making tempting decisions, right? The same thing can actually happen to the agent. The agent may also be captured by powerful private interests like business interests, for instance. Can we tell? Not necessarily, for example, your judges, they may be also, subject to bribery, for instance, right? They may have affiliations, maybe they are relatives of a very powerful business conglomerate. And when they interpret a law on a particular issue, they may interpret the law and make a decision that is favorable to a business community, right? Because they may have familial connections, or they're nepotistic, or they're cronyistic, and so on. Correct? Right. So can you guarantee 100% that the agent is not going to be tempted, to make these kinds of tempting decisions also, right? Or they are free from corruption altogether? Is there any such rule that that these independent institutions have to be free from corruption? No, not true, right? Yeah. So these two, the agent does not reveal true preferences, and the agent captured by powerful private interests, are very negative interpretations of the policy drift, right? A less negative interpretation of the policy drift would be the point that is on the right. Agent has specialized knowledge leading to a different viewpoint. So policy drift may occur. That means they may eventually end up proposing or attempting to implement a policy, right, that is not in the interest of the elected politician. But they may do so because they have a real, genuine information or knowledge-based reason for that, right? That means the politicians say we need to cut taxes, right? But then, we need to, correct, we need to cut taxes, right? But the agent says, okay, I understand that this is what your agenda actually is, but looking at the health of the economy, looking at what is required, right? It is not appropriate to do so, and then they propose policy at a different ideal point. But they're proposing the policy at a different ideal point. Policy drift has occurred. The politician may not be happy about it, right? But it may be a decision that is actually better in the long run for everyone. So if you look at these three reasons, right? Okay, the one about the agent has specialized knowledge leading to a different viewpoint, that may be the most positive interpretation of what the policy drift is. The other two are more negative in nature, right? So when you write your exam answer, highlight this as well, right? There are different reasons why policy drift may occur, right? Some, policy drift may occur, as a result of, specialized knowledge. So that is, policy drift but has got less negative reverberations, right? But if you look at, agent not revealing true preferences or agent being captured by powerful private interests, that is something that is, negative, may have long-term negative consequences on the polity as well. Understand? Okay, are we clear on this one? Okay? All right. Okay. So how do you limit the possibility of policy drift, right? Okay. So there are many ways. Just now, I think Asad asked that question about how you change, when politicians, sorry, when your independent institutions may be captured by these private interests, and you want to, bring them back on board, right? And ensure that, they in the end function the way they're supposed to function. There are different ways that, it can occur, right? So, for example, you can actually appoint new agents with closer policy preferences. But then that's a problem with that also, right? What are you basically doing? You're making the process more long drawn. Instead of just making policy decision, right? First you appoint one agent, then you appoint another agent to, to act as a check and balance, or to, function in a way that is closer to your own preferences. It only makes the process more costly in terms of resources, in terms of time spent, and so on, right? So, either appointing, agents with new agents with different policy preferences, or the one that is at the bottom down here on the bottom right, delegate to an alternative or additional agent as a check. You're just making the process longer, more complicated, more costly, right? Um, Another way, right, is to reduce discretion by limiting the agent's budget. Basically telling the agent, okay, I ask you to do this, I give you X amount of money. If you spend any more money, you cannot do anything about it, because policy formulation and implementation is very closely related to budget, right? So if I restrict your budget, can you implement something or formulate something that is very far away from what I, as the elected politician, thought about? Cannot, right? So I'm basically, putting a brake on how, you would function, right? Establish parliamentary scrutiny of the agent's actions, right? Basically, when you have parliamentary scrutiny, what you do is you get the agent to come to parliament and explain exactly what is it that they've been doing, like provide an update, provide a report, right? What is it that they've been doing? How they arrived at this decision? Is there a formula that they used? What are the justifications of decisions that they're being made, and so on? So you put them on parliamentary record and make them explain and justify all their decisions and behavior, right? And the last one, politicians revise existing laws, or they pass new legislation to clarify their policy position, right? This one I will explain in a subsequent slide down here, right? This one I've explained to you verbally already, right? The parliamentary scrutiny. The one about revising existing or passing new policy, right, is basically the idea where, they actually change the ideal point, right, or they change their proposed ideal point, because they want to ensure that whatever policy that is being passed is still closer to the legislature's ideal point, rather than what the agent is actually proposing. That means initially, if I propose a policy, say for example, at the point of the legislature, right, the ideal point down here, right, and the agent proposes an ideal point that is very far away, can there's no way that the elected politician can basically justify passing a policy that is so distinct away from their ideal point, which means they are not conforming to their policy platform, right? Or they're not conforming to the promises that they made to the electorate, right? So basically what they do is that to limit the large gap, right, they pass a new piece of legislation that is closer to the legislature's ideal point, right? So that's basically how they manipulate the process of implementing a policy by shifting the ideal points of legislation that is being passed, right? So this, what does this all tell you? What does this all tell you? You just complicated the process altogether. First, you introduce the agent. Then after that, you got to watch what the agent is doing. Then the agent is, doing his own thing, and then you're like, why is the agent doing your own thing? You need to go and rein the agent back in all over again. Then you need to do things like, limit their budget, tell them exactly how they're supposed to, formulate the policy, which might as well, if I'm going to tell you exactly how to do something, right, might as well I do it myself, right? Since Since I know how to do it, and I'm telling you exactly, follow step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, might as well I do it myself. If I'm going to only give you a limited amount of money, why ask you to do it at all? Correct? If I'm going to, be concerned about you passing legislation at a particular ideal point, then I go and pass a new piece of legislation to limit the gap in terms of the policy points. Might as well I just pass the policy to start off with also. So basically, what are you doing? You're just complicating the process of passing legislation, creating policies, right, and introducing another actor and adding on additional stress to the policy and decision-making process, right? So this is the dilemma or the conundrum, right, that elected politicians face when they delegate power away. You understand? So is it so easy just to say, oh, I do not have the technical expertise, come, I delegate power away to the agent and allow the agent to do all the dirty work for me? Is it that fuss-free, and is it that easy at all? How, and look at all of these different, reasons and rationale behind the policy drift. Is that healthy to a democracy also? Does that compromise, democratic decision making? Because now decisions are not made exactly according to what what the citizens may have wanted. Right? Can you see how we link this idea to remember earlier on we talked about the idea of representation, we talked about the idea of democracy and decision making processes, accountability, and so on, right? If there are so many issues associated with delegation of power, right, does that then compromise representation? Does that then compromise democracy? You understand logic down here? Can you see? Okay. If policy drift doesn't occur, then of course not an issue, right? But if policy drift occurs, right, then it's going to be extremely problematic. Okay. All right. This one here, I've already explained it to you verbally, so I'm not going to run through this diagram again. All right. Okay. Let me move on to this. Yeah. If you talk about if you're attempting to eliminate policy drift, and then you engage in all of the different ways, like you put them on parliamentary scrutiny, you make them you give them a particular budget, you reintroduce policy, and so on, right? What are you basically doing? The politician is now involved in the decision making process. You basically repoliticized what you depoliticized. Am I right? You wanted to remove political interference. You wanted to remove the decision making from the political cycle. But because all of these things were happening under the policy drift, right, the politician gets involved all over again. Politician gets involved all over again. What does that do? You're basically going back to square one, right? You're basically reintroducing political, influence into the policy making process, right? So it's like much ado about nothing at the end of the day, right? You just complicated the decision making process. So the rationale here would be to actually strike that suitable balance, right? Otherwise, it is counterproductive and counterintuitive to appoint the agent. It doesn't make sense, right? So that means there must be a balance. But how do you accurately predict what the interest of the agent actually is? How do you accurately predict how they are going to formulate policy? How do you accurately predict whether this is going to work out or not? This is where you get, decisions that are made by the unelected institutions, right? That, at the end of the day, the politician has to go do damage control, right? Because, sometimes things don't turn out the way they want it to turn out. So there's no foolproof, guaranteed successful formula, right, to delegation of power. That's basically the idea down here. Asad, sorry, you put up your hand just now. No? Okay. All right. Okay. So that's the rationale down here. So, there must be a balance, right? And at the end of the day, my question down here, number 2, right? Suitable balance, but in the interest of who? This must be the interest of who? The balance that you strike, right? That means just, appointing independent agent or independent institution, right, to make this decision. It must be beneficial to who? It must be beneficial to who at the end of the day? The citizens, correct? The citizens at the center of all of this, right? If it doesn't benefit the citizens, if it's not representative, then it is to the detriment of democracy. because the citizen is connected to the idea of democracy and representation. Can you see how the concept is connected? Clear? Clear? All right. Yeah. And ultimately, the ball does go back to the politician's court because they still have to monitor whether the agent is drifting away, right? So that's why we say, it can be a bit problematic. It complicates the process unnecessarily. Okay, let's watch this video very quickly. All right, and then let me share screen. Wait. Let's share. Chrome tab. This one.
Essays for school, but I also write sales descriptions for my Etsy shop.
I use Grammarly on my work emails and also on my cooking blog.
This video introduces the principal agent framework. In a simple form, the game has two players. The principal has a task that needs to be done. The agent can be assigned to do the task. The principal faces a series of decisions. He first needs to decide whether or not to do the task himself or to delegate to the agent. If he decides he wants to delegate the task, a range of new issues emerges. The principal needs to clearly specify the task so it can be communicated to the agent. He also needs to decide on which aspects of task are important to him. Ideally, the principal would like to hire a highly skilled and motivated agent with similar preferences as himself. Then there will be no need for controlling the agent. But more often than not, he will need to make some trade-offs. If the task is difficult, the principal's main concern might be with ability. Will the agent be able to expertly conduct the task? To secure a competent agent, the principal might be willing to hire someone with different preferences than himself. Then the scope of agency shirking introduces a different challenge. Here,
the agency shirking that he's referring to is similar to the policy drift that we're referring to. Okay? All right, he's just using a different term.
The problem is that the principal cannot verify the effort put in by the agent, only the outcome. He will decide whether or not to invest own effort into uncovering the type of the agent, or decide on some rule for how to react when seeing the outcome. And then there's agency drift. It arises when there's a diversion between the principal and the agent over what's the optimal outcome. The principal might want to limit the scope for drift. He could monitor the agent's action himself or hire a second agent to flag agency drift. Now let's consider a real example. You're busy working on a group project and want a cup of coffee. And in fact, you want a cafe latte with a double shot of espresso. One member of the group has done her task, so you ask her to fetch the cafe latte for you so you can focus on the group project. And this is not a task that requires special skills, but it provides some scope for shirking. She might go for a latte with a single shot, expecting that you will not notice. After all, a single shot latte is cheaper. And you might perhaps prevent this if you require her to verify the order by providing a receipt.
Can you see how it's the analogy, right? I ask you to do something, but you say, okay, I have a different interest, or I think it's cheaper to do it in this particular way, and I engage in policy drift, right? Okay, don't use this coffee example in your exam. All right, this is just to help you to understand the logic of the shirking and the policy drift.
Also, she must simply decide that the time it takes to wait for the barista to make the latte is not worth. So she will just order black coffee. While this is not the cafe latte with a double shot of espresso that you wanted, it's nevertheless coffee. And as a result of this experience, you might decide that it's better to buy your own coffee the next time. Now, success.
Right? Why bother to delegate at all, right? That's the logic down here. Okay? All right, let me go back to... Okay, wait, how do I do this? Well, where's my playlist? But... Never mind. Wait. Okay, Ayo. Oh, sorry, I forgot to turn off the mic. Sorry, Yanyu. Sorry, I wasn't. Yeah, there was. I'm sorry, Yanyu. I was supposed to put myself on mute. Now then I see. Sorry. Okay, anyway, the video is linked. So you can take a look at it. All right, okay. So sorry about that. Okay, so let's look specifically at the independent courts now. So we've got all that theory already settled already, right? So now look at the independent courts. Okay, so when you look at the independent courts, right, basically what we're looking at is this idea of constitutionalism. And you've got two types. One, you've got legislative supremacy constitution, right? And then you've got the higher law constitution, okay? All right. So when you look at these two, right, this is an indicator of how independent the courts basically may be, right? Okay, what are the different models of constitution? What are we referring to here is the relationship. Can you please write this down here? Right, in simple language, right? When you look at the models of constitutionalism, right, we are referring to legislative judicial relations. In other words, right, it is the relationship between the courts and the politicians. That is what the models of constitutionalism basically are. The relationship between the courts and the politicians. Okay? All right? Okay. So when you look at the legislative supremacy constitution, the title of that already is indicative, right? That means the parliamentary majority, the legislature, right, is supreme. They can do no wrong, right? Basically, they do not have to be told how to interpret law and so on, right? Okay, so if they have the majority in the government, right? And where did they get the majority from? It is mandated by the electorate because they are voted in, correct? Right? So they voted in and therefore they are mandated by the people. They have the legitimacy, right, to do what they want to do. They set the agenda, formulate policy, and so on, right? So in this case, right, every single government that gets elected is supreme. That means there's no such thing as you cannot delegate certain functions to an independent authority, right, and tell a parliament, in future how to behave, because every single government and that comes into power, right, is supreme because they are the ones that are legitimate, right? They are the ones that receive the mandate from the people, correct? Okay, so that's the rationale down here. It is not possible to delegate certain functions to an independent authority to dictate how a future parliament can actually act, right? And the logic is that if you delegate power to an independent institution, then that is actually restricting the way a future parliament, that means the next government who gets voted in, right? You're restricting the way they can function or the way they can act because you basically have taken away their powers. Correct? That's the logic down here. You understand the rationale? Okay? All right. So in this case, the Supreme Court is, may function, right? But it is at the behest of Parliament in terms of powers. Meaning, right, at the end of the day, when you have a court or you have a Supreme Court or you have the judges, right, the courts may actually implement decisions made by the politicians. That means decisions that are made by the courts, are they independent of the political process? Are they insulated from political interference? No, they're not, right? That means the elected politicians tell the courts how they want a decision to be implemented, how they want law to be interpreted, right? The courts may be able to strike down a particular parliamentary act in the short term, right? But at the end of the day, it goes back to reconsideration, at the legislature all over again, right? So what basically you're looking at is that the courts in this scenario under the legislative supremacy constitution, the courts are in a less powerful position. In some cases, they may be subjugated to the interests, or in a more negative way, they may be subjugated to the whims and the fancies of the elected politicians. Understand? Okay, so Parliament can, ultimately enact a new law, rein in the powers of the court if necessary, sack the existing judges and, appoint the judges that they are interested in, right? And put them in power, in positions of power, right? The higher law constitution is the opposite of this, right? The logic is that the state, which is represented by the elected politicians, they may actually do legal wrong. And they may do legal wrong if they are if they are office seeking, if they're interested in income, power, and prestige. They may compromise on their policy position. They may interpret law that is in a way beneficial to only a certain group of people rather than respond to as many people as possible. So the rights, right, must be protected from the legislature. So there is a constitutional law or a fundamental law that cannot be changed by a simple act of parliament or a simple legislative majority, right? There must, if you want to, make any sort of changes, right, it requires a written constitution, and it must go to the judges. It must go to an independent court that, will interpret the behavior of the legislature, ensure that there's no violation or contradiction of principles. Say, like, for example, Article 15 in the Singapore Constitution mandates the protection of religion, and individuals are free to practice whatever religion that they want to practice, unless it is a law and order issue, right? So whether it is PAP who's in power, or PSP, or Workers' Party, or whoever who comes into power subsequently, right? Basically, they would have to abide by the same rationale. And if they want to change anything, it has to be a written change of the constitution, which has to be then approved by the courts, for instance, right? Okay. All right. So the Supreme Court, right, is mandated to protect certain types of rights, right? It may be enshrined in the Constitution, it may be enshrined in the Bill of Rights, right? So no matter whichever government comes in, right, the courts can easily say, sorry, this is have you heard, you've heard of this, right? This is unconstitutional. You cannot, anyhow make this decision, right? You cannot rewrite law, right? Okay, that's the rationale down here. Okay, all right. So that is the different models of constitutionalism. Okay. All right. So in some countries, right, it may not be so clear cut. That means it may not fall into such a beautiful category like what you see down here, right? Either it's a legislative supremacy constitution or it's a higher law constitution, because as we know, right, theoretically this may be the structure, but as states implement these kinds of structures, right, in their polities, they may make some adaptations, right? Just like how you've got adaptations to the Westminster Parliamentary system in Singapore, right? It doesn't look exactly like how it looks like in the UK. Same thing down here, right? For example, in UK, right? While it was supposed to be legislative supremacy, that means the legislature is supreme, right? They have other things like the Human Rights Act and the Supreme Court that have gained traction, right? It's very difficult for them to reverse this, right? And you can't arbitrarily take away the powers because it's been in power for that many years, right? So rather than to say that it is purely a legislative supremacy constitutional model, right, it may have some features, right, of the other model, right, which is the higher constitution, right, in order to ensure that there is some form of checks and balances, right? So as they are implemented in real life, right, in actual states, there may be some tweaks that have been made, right, to ensure that there are some checks and balances that occur. Yeah, sir. These are the two main models that we are referring to. There may be other models, right? But for it, I think it largely falls under these two main categories, right? There may be some variations along the way depending on different theorists and so on, right? But these are the two main models that we are looking at. And I think Clark Golder also referred to these two in particular. Okay, all right. Okay, so in this case, right, the USA, which is supposed to be a higher law constitution, right, but what happens is that in real life, and especially like what we saw in the case of Trump's reign in particular, it became very clear. While it is supposed to fall under the rubric of the higher law constitutionalism, right, there was a separation of powers legally and formally. The appointment of judges in the US is not entirely free from political interference, like what we saw the appointment of Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett and so on, right? So, it's not entirely free from political control. So like I said, sometimes it straddles between the both, or where convenient, right, certain aspects get played out in different, in different eras, depending on the politicians, depending on the political parties that, are in control of government. Okay? All right. So giving you, a rundown, right? Generally, this is how you would, understand the appointment of judges in different countries, right? And it, highlights to you whether they are partisan or non-partisan. Of the three, I think the French one is considered to be, extremely partisan because the courts, right, and the judges, they're basically referred to as the third branch of the legislature. That means that is how closely connected they are to the political machinery, right, in comparison to the others. Okay, all right. Okay, so the rationale down here, remember just now, I talked about how it is important to use the continuum, right? So the continuum is actually more, important and more useful, right, to understand, the logic of whether the courts, in this case in particular, is the court independent or is it not independent, right? That is, where it is, relevant, because you will see that changes occur in different countries accordingly to different, political parties, according to the year and so on. So, for example, say in Sri Lanka, right? In the under the previous, I think 2 or 3 previous presidents, right? Under one of the Rajapaksas, the former Chief Justice, after being appointed, right, 48 hours later, there was a report to say that he was impeached. Why? Because 48 hours. He was just Supreme Court judge. No, sorry. So he was just Chief Justice for 48 hours because he didn't obey the executive. And there have been reports in other instances where judges' houses, have been stoned for neglecting executive orders. They've been, they're. I think there was a particular example where I think the children of some judges were kidnapped, right, and held hostage because they didn't, respond to what some of the politicians basically wanted and so on. So these are isolated incidences, of course. Yes, it doesn't mean that the entire judicial process, in Sri Lanka is compromised or anything. But these are indicators, right, that different eras, under different politicians, you may experience different interpretations of independence of the courts, right? Same thing like what I mentioned to you just now, in the case of Poland, right? Judicial independence, has seemed to be deteriorated in about 45 countries since about 2017, right? And Poland is one of those who is a stark, indicator in the HR Outlook report, particularly when they made a lot of judicial reforms, right, allowing the risk of increased political intervention by politicians, right, in the judicial process. You take a look at that article that I've included for you that basically gives you a rundown, right, on the various issues that Poland has compromised on, which has irked the EU, right, to no end, and basically place them at odds, right. Hungary is another one. Poland and Hungary are the two, who have basically have had made a lot of domestic changes to their domestic institutions, which are at total odds with the laws of the European Union, right? So these two are the problem children that you may want to take a look at. Why delegate to independent courts, right? So in this case, remember, why is it that you want courts to be independent and take care of interpretation of law? First thing that is the most important is that what is law basically about? It is about protection of human rights, right? So that is the rationale down here, right? The Bill of Rights is what people are entitled to against every government on earth, general or particular, right? And what no just government should refuse. But rights, human rights, right, can be trampled upon by particular politicians or by particular political parties, right, if they feel that, and upholding these human rights is going to be at odds with a particular vision that they have or you may have a scenario where you have, intense cleavages within a state, and the government is made up of a particular ethnic group or a particular cleavage, like a minority versus a majority, and they may not be inclined to protect the rights of every single person, right, in a very equal manner. And therefore, if you have a Bill of Rights, or if it's enshrined in the Constitution, politicians basically cannot, contravene this. They should basically uphold it, right? So protection of human rights is one of the main reasons, right? And then another, idea here is the complete legislative contracts. This one is quite interesting. It's an interesting point, but it's very commonsensical. The logic is that when you formulate a law or a piece of legislation, right, it is formulated, with the intention of addressing a particular issue. Say, like, for example, when they formulated the Foreign Interference Countermeasures Act in Singapore, the FICA, right, or POFMA and so on, right, there was a reason or motivation for formulating such a law, right? Or, in any country, some countries, they have an Internal Security Act, right? So the reason is to protect, the state from subversion or foreign interference and so on. That is the main motivation behind the law. But when they are formulating the law, say, like, for example, they've just recently formulated FICA, can they possibly imagine every single scenario in which that law can be interpreted and implemented? Cannot, right? So that is what the function of the courts basically is to interpret, right? That's what, law is about, right? The courts, the judiciary is there to interpret law. So you have a law, right? Does it, apply in this particular scenario? If it applies in this particular scenario, I know exactly what clauses apply to it. Are there any conditions? Are there any exclusions? What do you need to, take into consideration of, right? So that is, what, the point of having an independent court actually is. That is where you have got the point of expertise, right? And then subsequently, you also have got courts to control over other agents, right? So the courts may actually function as judicial oversight, right? Okay. Then, policy drift can actually occur, right? So remember, like what we discussed earlier on, depending on, who is appointed, who appoints the judges, who are they, do they have got, have they got any kind of affiliations? Do they come from a particular ethnic background? Say, for example, when they were looking at the appointment of judges during Trump's era, right? What was the main focus? What did they usually focus on? Are they all male, or are they all female? Are there any females on at all? Do you have any representation in terms of ethnic cleavages? So do you have judges from who are, say, for example, Hispanic or Latin American, right? What kind of educational backgrounds do they come from, right? Are they affiliated to the Republican Party, or are they affiliated to the Democrats, and so on, right? So that's the the rationale down here. If they all come from a particular ethnic group, right, then they may be inclined to to interpret law that may benefit that particular ethnic group. If they are all male, for instance, right, how do they make decisions? Remember, the criticism of a lot of the harsh abortion laws in the U.S., right? They say no uterus, no talk, right? Why are people who are above 70 years old, wrinkled, white old men making decisions, right, that are relating to women's reproductive rights and so on, right? That's the rationale down here, right? So, that's basically the idea, right? Because they're coming from a particular ingrained, preconceived perspective, right? And, how fair would their interpretation of law actually be, right? Okay, so that's another problem there. Okay, and another issue, the point down there with the yellow bubble, speech bubble, right? Remember we talked about just now the macro and the micro view, right? So that's what we're referring to, right? They're focused on very specific individual instances. They're focused on particular individual rights. They may not see how a particular law is connected to other policy issue areas that politicians may have insight on, right? Okay, so that can be quite problematic. So the macro versus the micro view. And then the last one, in many cases, right, when you want to have law, when you bring a case, right, it costs a lot of money, right? Can the poor easily access courts and moot a civil rights action or a class action suit against a particular conglomerate, or can they just directly access judges and lawyers and courts and so on? Not necessarily, right? So often the wealthy are usually the ones who have access to courts to define legislation in their own interest, which again is a compromise on democracy, right? Everybody should have access to the courts and the laws and so on, right? But in some cases, unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. Okay, all right. Okay, let's look at euthanasia. All right, so like what I explained to you earlier on, right? When you looked at euthanasia, right, initially it was a criminal offense in the 1980s, right? And what you started to see was policy drift, all right? You started to see the court interpret it more and more liberally. They started to think about how euthanasia could be made acceptable, right, if certain conditions were present, right, and therefore they started to shift away from the position that euthanasia was illegal and started to acquit doctors, right? So in particular, what happened was that they performed the function of policy advocacy in the sense that they were interpreting the law relating to euthanasia closer to their own ideal point rather than what the government had actually decided. Government decided euthanasia is illegal, right? But the ideal point of the court was to say, no, all right, there are conditions that make euthanasia acceptable. Say, for example, if an individual has basically lost all will to live, or an individual is suffering from a chronic terminal disease and there's no way, right, that they're going to enjoy quality of life like the rest of us, right, or the rest of society, then what is the point of them living anymore? Might as well allow them to to be euthanized, right? So that means there are some conditions to qualify to qualify individuals to say that they are allowed to be euthanized, right? And subsequently what happened was where this became very problematic is that they started to see a drastic rise in the number of people who are seeking euthanasia and the number of people, of doctors who are being acquitted. That means when they conduct euthanasia, they do get arrested, they do get to court, but the court eventually says they are not guilty, right? So the logic was that they were very concerned because there was a change in welfare policy in Netherlands. They had previously a cradle to grave welfare policy, meaning that the welfare policy is applicable to people no matter how old they are. But subsequently, they started to take away some of these rights. So some people were opting for euthanasia simply because they realized that they run out of money to fund their medical bills. They no longer enjoy quality of life as they used to know it because they're no longer well to do anymore. The standard of living has increased, right? So that was a basic a problem identified, right? So there were a lot of debates associated with it. In the subsequent slide down here, right, I've given you several different links, right? I do not have time to watch the videos with you, but please watch it. Some of it is quite long, right? And some of it basically highlight individual cases why particular people have decided to go for euthanasia. What are the debates associated with it? Like this one, the right to die debate rages in the Netherlands and so on, right? And the last two right are more recent developments. Okay, all right. So basically what happened, right, is that there was from the 1980s where it was illegal, 1993, about 13 years it took, right, for the courts and the politicians to negotiate and come to a viewpoint, and eventually the government, right, and the politicians accepted the court's interpretation. But remember, it was government who said it's illegal, right? The courts are the ones that interpreted it liberally. So in this case, the independent court is the one that basically, decided that euthanasia should be legal, and eventually the politicians and the political parties had little choice but to go along with this decision, right? So that basically highlights it's a huge policy drift, right? Because from illegal to legal, That's the rationale down here, right? It's an extremely huge policy drift, right? Okay, and then your subject guide, basically gives an idea. Of course, the differences between the different political parties, when they were negotiating it. So some, notably, your small Christian-oriented political parties will be the ones who say, no, we cannot allow euthanasia because life is given by God. How can you make this arbitrary decision? It's assisted suicide, like that's what euthanasia is about. Y'all know what? Wait, everybody knows what euthanasia is, right? Yeah, it's assisted suicide, right? Or what they refer to as what's that? Mercy killing, right? That's the other phrase that they use when they refer to euthanasia. So you had, different political parties, right? Had, different positions that they were taking. Your ruling coalition parties, they themselves were divided whether or not, they should, agree with the decision made by the courts and so on, right? And at the end of the day, after several years of negotiations, about 13 years, right, that was when they all came on board and said, okay, fine, we'll agree to euthanasia, right? Subsequently, it's been expanded even to children here, terminally ill children under 12, also people experiencing psychological or psychiatric conditions and so on, right? And there was in between, because the debate was raging on, and they're thinking that is it too liberal interpretation? Have the numbers spiked so much that do we need to rethink whether euthanasia is meant to be legal, right? That's where you get the last article. Dutch law got a little too comfortable with euthanasia because of the numbers that have spiked, right? And subsequently, there was one case, the landmark case in November 2020, where the two doctors basically almost got into trouble as a result of a particular case, and the courts insisted on interpreting it more liberally. All right. And then, as a result of this, right, other states in the EU and in Europe have also, started to implement laws, right? Belgium, Italy, Germany, right, have also, made, Luxembourg, right? They have actually, passed laws to make euthanasia legal, right? Okay. I think the DJ Fabo ruling, right? This one, the Italian one, right? This was a very highly controversial case. Please take a look at that article, because that seems to be one of the particular examples in the euthanasia debate that is consistently referenced to. All right, the DJ Fabo one. All right, so take a look at that one. Okay. All right. I could not. Might be a side question, but can policy drift be viewed as reflecting society's natural development progression over time? It could be, right? That, like say, for example, like what we saw in the euthanasia case, right? The changes, to the cradle to grave welfare policy, and, people asserting their rights, why should I not have the right to decide when and how I should die? And why, is the courts, or why is politicians telling me that I should just live with particular, conditions? Why should I live with the negative effects of old age, or the negative effects of dementia and so on? People more assertive of their individual rights and say, I should be able to make the decision myself, right? So yeah, I would say, Ryan, I would, somewhat agree with you that, policy drift, that is reflected in the positions that, in this case, the courts took, right, is reflective of, what general sentiment in society actually is as well, right? Okay, yeah. The policy drift will be viewed as negative, right? Because policy drift and the principal agent framework basically look at the relationship between the politicians and the independent institutions. But the policy drift may occur and may be positive in the sense that that is what people or individuals in society want. But the rationale here also is that maybe it's a group of people in society that want something, but not everybody else in society agrees with it. So even society can be fragmented, and there can be a dilemma within society, correct? So if I just, want to reduce it to being positive or negative, right, then that will ignore all of the other, elements associated with the relationship between the independent institutions and the agent, right? And the principal and the agent, right, Ryan? You understand? Okay. All right, I tried to look for more recent statistics with the graph like this, right? But unfortunately, everything seems to be hovering around latest 2016, 2006, 2017, and that's about it. There were no images that I could put in for you, but that's basically the idea there. Okay, let's look at the central bank, right? Okay. So when you look at the central banks, right? Okay, important thing here, just like how we discussed, right? With the euthanasia case, we started off by discussing the need for independence, right? And when how did we start to discuss for the need for independence? We talked about the logic of the different models of constitutionalism. That is forms the basis. What is the relationship between politicians and the law? Right, okay, and that tells us why is it that certain things need to be protected from politician or need to be protected from the political cycle, right? So same thing, if you are going to write your answer, right, and you're going to use central bank as your choice, all right, what you would need to do first, right, after you've discussed the principal agent framework and the policy drift and all the technical aspects, right, what you would need to do is to talk about what is the role and the function of central banks, right? That is the important point. If you do not provide this background, right, then how do you critique, right, whether central banks should be independent or should not be independent, correct? All right, so you need to first discuss what is it that the central banks are supposed to do. Right, so I've given you this pie chart diagram, right, that summarizes, the idea down here. For those who do not do econs or for those who are less familiar, with, all these economic aspects, right? I think, a summary version, because, how much can you write also, right? So a summary version of, in the first place, what is the role of central bank is necessary. Can you please write this down? Right, if you're using central bank as an example, first thing you need to do, right, is to talk about the role and the function of central bank. Second thing that you need to do, right, would then be to explain, right, okay, when and why independence is good or not good in terms of central banks. All right, so these are the two main things you must provide, right, when you are discussing, the logic of independent central banks. Then you go on to the specific example. Okay, wait, let me just give you the overview. Then you go on to that specific example, right, of the UK central bank, and the specific example when they looked at the New Labour in 1997. I would recommend, I know this is a dated example, right? But I would still recommend using this example as it is mentioned in the subject guide, right? Because it clearly shows you, right, the lack of independence in this particular instance, right? So what you would do is, when you are using examples that are not entirely correct, right, make sure you refer to the timeline. So say under New Labour government in 1997, right, this is an illustration of what a supposedly independent central bank behaved like, right, and how it was a reflection of a lack of independence, even though, right, they were supposedly independent. Okay, all right, so that is the three main steps that you would need to take when you are using the central bank as an example. Okay, all right, are we clear on this one? All right, so I'm just going to run through briefly, right, some of the ideas down here, right? When you look at, the central bank, right, basically, take a look at your subject guide, page 177, right, refers to the logic on currency policy, right? And what you want to talk about, is that what is it that central banks are basically interested in? They're interested, right, in looking at the maintenance of inflation rate. They're looking at, the logic of monetary policy, right? So they are attempting to create some levels of stability. Okay, so basically what your central bank is really concerned about, right, is looking at the stability of the inflation rate. But there is something that you need to include down here, right? Should central banks be blamed for the growth of the economy? Right, so if you find that a state's economy, right, is not extremely healthy, right, or is not registering high levels of GDP growth and so on, right, is that really the responsibility of the central bank? No, that isn't. that is the responsibility of the elected politicians, right? Because they are the ones who are making economic policy. They are the ones who are responsible for economic management, right? So, sometimes there is misplaced blame, right, on these institutions, right? So we need to think carefully about that. So you go back to this diagram down here, right? What is it that they're supposed to pay attention to? Advise government on sound economic policy, regulate, supervise the banking industry. They buy, bonds, to finance, the exchequer. They serve as a lender of last resort. They hold the gold reserves. They are basically managing the foreign exchange, right? They act in the forex markets and so on. They set the interest rates. Are they responsible for economic growth per se? They're not responsible for economic growth per se, right? Okay. So think about it. When you lay blame, right, on the logic of the independent central bank and so on, right? Okay. So like what Alessina and Summers refer to, the more independent the central bank, the lower the inflation rate, but no relationship between independence and economic growth. Can you please highlight that? All right, because that would prevent you from making an argument, a mistaken argument in the final exam, right? By saying that, a state basically has experienced, lower economic growth, or economic mismanagement, and it's the reason, why it has, done so is because the independent central bank has made decisions that are detrimental to the economy, right? So that's not entirely the case, right? Okay. So be careful when you level blame. All right. So basically what you're trying to do, right, when you talk about the independence of the central bank, is to bring it back to the idea. Why do you need to remove politicians away, right? So the rationale is that basically you want to prevent politicians, right, from trying to buy votes with money, right? So politicians, they sometimes may not be able to keep inflation under control because they may make promises to the make promises to the electorate, right? In the run up to elections, they say that we will target inflation, or we will manage monetary policy such that it will be beneficial to you at the end of the day, right? So the rationale is that that is the rationale behind why you want to have independent central banks, right? But often independent central banks are or central bankers are seen to be quite conservative, right? They err on the side of caution. Sometimes they're very slow to act, right? Sometimes central banks, like the economic crisis in 2000, right? You have a scenario where the central banks were basically blamed, right, for not acting in a more responsible manner, allowing the asset bubble to build up, and thinking of more focus on a particular aspect of keeping inflation low, but not really thinking about what kind of stimulus they can provide to the economy, right? So in this case, there is an issue related with allowing too much independence, right, for the central bank. I've uploaded an article for you in eGlobal, right? Okay, and I've given you a link down here also, right? I've uploaded an article for you in eGlobal that explains or discusses when can it be dangerous to allow the central banks to be too independent and totally removed from the political cycle. So if you want to think about it, right, when it comes to formulating monetary policy, fiscal policy, inflation, and so on, there should be what this entire argument is about, right? Is that there should be some kind of balance. Monetary policy is too important to be left to politicians, especially if politicians are going to function in an office-seeking manner. But at the same time, right, if central banks are going to act in a very fiscally conservative manner, and they're going to be very slow, they're not going to introduce enough stimulus into the economy, then it can also be extremely problematic, right? So there must be some kind of balance. That means ideally, right, there are political costs, right, and fiscal costs associated with allowing either too independent a central bank, or allowing politicians, right, to be too involved in the formulation of monetary policy, right? So that is where we need to think about how there must be a balance. So the last point on this slide down here, if any kind of fiscal crisis is to be tackled effectively, there must be input from both the technical experts of the central bank as well as political interference, right? So this is where we get that conundrum, right? Remember that I mentioned earlier on, there must be some suitable balance that is to be struck. And if the suitable balance is not struck, then the ones that are going to face the most amount of pressure would be the citizens, right? Okay, right? Because inflation and economic mismanagement, who is the one that bears the brunt of it? It is the citizens. Because the first thing that's going to be affected is employment, income, standard of living, right? Okay, all right. So there are different kinds of central banks, right? So you've got the U.S. Reserve Central Bank, then you've got the European Central Bank, right? The European Central Bank, I think, is considered to be one of the more, like in comparison to other central banks, I think it's one of the more independent ones, right? But look at the UK. The UK one is actually very interesting, right? Post 1997, please underline that, independent but dependent. All right, that is the key point down here, right? So the Bank of England, right, basically, in the pre-1997 period, it was not independent, right? Okay, in the post-1997 period, right, it was basically considered to be independent, right? So what they basically highlighted was that, we are independent, and there's a necessity to shift away from being not independent to independent, because they wanted to say that, they have more discretion in maintaining monetary and financial stability, and they do not have the politicians interfering. But if you think about how the board in the Bank of England is actually appointed, you would actually arrive at very different conclusions, right? So just look at these bullet points down here, right? Okay. Number one, the main problem down here is your finance minister, who sets the inflation target, right? So that is already a high level of political interference. The central bank will set the interest rate in order to meet this inflation target. Basically, I'm telling you what to do. You formulate the route to get to that target, right? So does that suggest that it is entirely independent? No, it doesn't. All right. The other issue down here, all right, is that it is owned by the UK government. Previously, until 1946, it was private. Now it is owned by UK government. Suggests interference as well, right? The Parliament gives the Bank of England extremely precise goals and responsibilities. Basically, I tell you exactly what I need you to do. Again, does that suggest independence or not, right? And then finally, right, it is answerable to the UK Parliament and the public via reports and public meetings. What is that? That is parliamentary scrutiny, correct? Remember we discussed that earlier on, right? How do you limit policy drift, and how do you how do you decrease the level of independence of a particular independent institution, right? Is to put them on parliamentary record, right? And this is basically what it is, right? And then subsequently look at this, right? Okay, look at the membership. Okay, look at the second point down here on this slide down here. All right, you've got 9 members, all right, at this point, in the New Labour, right, in 1997, under New Labour government, right? So you've got the Chancellor of Exchequer, right, who was, basically your Prime Minister. He sets the inflation target, right? And then you get this, the appointment, the governor and 2 deputy governors appointed by 5 years by the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Who is who? A politician, right? Okay. And then you've got 4 other, then you've got the others, the remaining 2 appointed by the government after consultation with the Chancellor of Exchequer. Again, is the appointment independent? It is not independent. Then you've got 4 other members from elsewhere, right? Not from the bank directly, right? Again, appointed by the Chancellor of Exchequer. So the entire appointment process, right, and all of the individuals who are sitting on the board, right, are all actually appointed by a political figure, right? So again, remember this one I talked about how appointment, right, suggests whether it is independent or not, right? Okay, and then the other thing is this, right? Prior to appointment, there's a hearing, right, for approval held before the House of Commons Treasury Select Committee, which can neither approve nor veto. So it's just like a formality process. So basically, if you cannot approve or you cannot veto, right, then why even have the hearing at all, right? That's why I say here for what? right? Okay, so that's another problem down there. So it suggests, that's why I tell you, independent, because they claim to be independent, but they're actually not independent, right? Okay, yeah, exactly. That's my point, right? That's why I say independent but not independent. All right, okay. And then what they did was Hicks, and his team, basically they wanted to analyze the voting behavior of the ideal points of these various members on the Bank of England, right, the MPC committee. So what they did was, they used a Dove-Hawk scale to look at the ideal points of these MPC members, right, the Monetary Policy Committee. So if you're engaging in dovish behavior, you vote for cutting interest rates. If you engage in hawkish behavior, you want to increase interest rates. All right. So if you look even today, also when you Google, if you just Google, right, the MPC of the Bank of England, right, they will show you who are the different members, right, and then how they generally tend to vote, right, and this is what you saw, right, in 1997. Okay, all right, they basically had different approaches. They engaged in dovish and hawkish behavior, not based on the health of the economy, not based on their discretion, not based on independence, but more in line with what the government actually wanted to do in terms of public spending, right? Okay, so you look at this, right? It was basically matching the needs of government public spending policies, all right? When they first came into power, New Labour, all right, MPC was dovish, right? They were interested in cutting interest rates. Why? Because when New Labour came into power, they had made a promise to the electorate to say that, okay, we will uphold whatever monetary policy the previous government had put in place, which means they made a commitment to stick to the taxation and the public spending policies that were made by the previous government. So that was fairly restrictive. Because it was restrictive, right, the only way they could function was to recommend cutting interest rates. And that is exactly how the MPC, the Monetary Policy Committee, formulated their policies. Not for any other reason, but because that was the commitment of the New Labour government. So, independent or not independent? Not independent, right? And then you look at the second and the third term, when New Labour was still in power. Now, they did not now they were re-elected, right? Do they still need to follow and make promises and say that we will implement the policies of the previous government? No need. So what did they do? In order to remain in power and in order to continue to be attractive to the electorate, they embarked on a huge public expenditure program, right? And it was considered to be one of the largest public expenditure program, right, since World War II. And in order to combat rising inflation, right, the MPC started to increase interest rates, right, and they behaved in a hawkish manner. So again, is that reflective of what the economy needed, or is that reflective of inflation stability? Monetary policy stability that was more in line of what the government wanted to do, right, and they formulated the policy accordingly. So that suggests to you, in direct contrast, to like what we saw in the euthanasia example, right? The euthanasia example, the courts were so independent that the courts made the decision, and eventually the government negotiated for 13 years and finally came to the conclusion, okay, we'll take the same policy stance as the courts. In the case of 1997 Bank of England, complete opposite, right? They basically, the supposedly independent institution took the cue, right, from government instead, right? Okay, so I've given you some, this was the article I was asking you to read. Central bank independence, is that even a thing, right? This one is uploaded for you in eGlobal, right? Okay, take a look at this, and then, this one, sir. The dangers of politicizing independent central banks. I think this one I have not uploaded for you. I'm not sure. I think I might have missed this one out, right? I know this one I uploaded because this was a newer article. All right, so take a look at some of these. Let me go back and double check whether which are the articles I've uploaded and whether I missed out any or not. Right, I'll double check and upload any missing ones from you. All right, so that's the rationale, right, behind this whole discussion down here. Okay, so at the end of the day, when you look at this topic, right, remember that balance, number one, is very necessary. Number two, right, you need to think about what is the meaning of independence, how good is independence, right? How does it compromise how does it affect democracy? How does it affect the individuals? How does it affect, the society, right? How much independence is actually useful to society? If you are going to, consistently have a scenario where there's policy drift, right, and you have a scenario where neither the politicians are, can be trusted to make good policies, nor, right, do you have a scenario where your independent institutions can be trusted to make independent decisions that have not been, captured or hijacked by other private interests and so on. A balance between this is extremely necessary, right? So when you answer a question on, independent institutions, think very carefully about your conclusion, right? Think about how independence affects democracy. How does it affect the individual voter, right? Whether, and most importantly, all right, can you please underline or highlight the last statement on this slide? If I was a student writing an answer, right, in the final exam, right, I would make sure I include this statement. Whether independent or dependent, right, whether it is higher, law constitutionalism, or whether it is legislative supremacy constitutionalism, whether it is an independent central bank or not. What is important at the end of the day, right, is that the institution that is making the decision must always make decisions that are beneficial to the polity. So you can argue till the cows come home whether an independent central bank is useful or not. But if your independent central bank is not making decisions that are beneficial to the polity, what is the point of being independent? If the independent central court, right, is not making decisions that are beneficial to the individuals, and they're making decisions based on one particular, policy viewpoint, what is the point of independence? Correct? What is the point of insulating it from political interference if it is not a decision that is good for society? Right? You understand the logic down here? Okay, so that is how I would like to conclude, right, this discussion. If I was writing the exam answer, I would definitely put that last statement in my evaluative conclusion. Okay? All right. Next week, I will see you for economic performance, right? One of the very dry topics, more dry than this one. All right. See you. Bye-bye. Take care. Bye. Bye.